Well, hello and welcome to the Profit Express. I'm Tim Healy, and I'm inviting you to join me each and every Wednesday so you can be prepared to win the battle for business. Now, I know you're out there hustling. You're closing deals. You're making money. You're turning prospects into profits. So I've got to make it worth your while. That's why I have on the kinds of guests that you can listen, learn, and earn from. Today's guest will be no exception. So as always, I thank you for sharing some of your time with me today and being on board the Profit Express. Now, the topic for today is a tool that is incredibly important and powerful. It is a tool that every human being on the planet has at their very fingertips. Now, this tool can work one of two ways. It could be positive and empowering, and it could lead you to a life full of success, or this very tool could be negative and limiting, and it could lead you to a life full of excuses and mediocrity. Now you're thinking, Tim, what is this tool? What are you talking about? This tool are the very own stories that you tell yourself each and every day. It's the stories that you tell yourself about your personal life, your professional life, your life about your romance, your relationships. They are the stories that follow us through each and every day. And they can either propel us to success or lead us to a life full of mediocrity. And it is a topic and a subject that I've been reading about for many, many years. I know the power of our very own stories myself. It's had a tremendous impact on my life. So that's why I'm very, very excited for today's guest. Not only is she a best-selling author on the subject, she's also a chief storytelling officer for Success Magazine. And we're here to talk about her new book. She's Kindra Hall. Her new book is Choose Your Story, Change Your Life. And before I have her on in just a moment, I always say in the Profit Express, hey, this is a book that you got to have on your business bookshelf. And I certainly mean it with this one. But this is not just a business bookshelf book, if you will. This is a life book for everybody, in my opinion. And that is why I'm very excited to have Kindra on, because I know she's going to shine light on the tool that are our very own stories that each and every human being on the planet tells themselves each and every day. So why don't we just harness them? Why don't we take advantage of them to propel us to the success that we're really capable of? So that being said, it's time to have on board the Profit Express, Kindra Hall. How are you today?
I am so great. So happy to be here. I'm already taking notes, even just through your intro. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Listen, I think you could probably tell it's a topic I'm passionate about, because I know I've been reading about it for years, and it's had a profound impact on me. So when I saw your book, I had to have you on. So listen, thanks for sharing your time with me today.
Happy to be here, and thanks to everyone listening.
Absolutely. So I have to start with this question. How does someone become a chief storytelling officer? I got to start with that.
I know. It sounds made up as a title, doesn't it?
No, it sounds awesome, actually.
It is. It was just a title that fit. I told my first story when I was 11. I was one of those people who, my career found me, and I just had to kind of get on board. And ever since that time, I was either telling stories, studying stories, or teaching stories. And to every carpenter, that there's a board and everything looks like to the person holding the hammer. What is that? Everything looks like a nail. And to me, everything is a story. And so that chief storytelling officer just seemed like a great fit from the get-go.
That was, you were destined to have that title, essentially.
It really was. And in that role, so in the role of chief storytelling officer, it really was my job to it was taking interviews and having conversations, but to listen to the stories as my guests or subjects were sharing them and try to dissect, okay, what is the mindset of a super successful person, and what stories are they telling themselves to make that possible?
Okay, so now let's dive into the subject of stories. Why do humans tell stories?
That humans have told stories since the beginning of our rapid evolution. The
Hmm.
fact that we can communicate, dangers and strategies and lessons that we've learned in compelling ways in stories was responsible for our evolution as a species. So,
Hmm.
not only do we tell stories to communicate information, but we also tell stories to ourselves to catalog our experiences, to make decisions, make sense of the world around us, and perhaps most importantly, our place in it.
So it's obviously, the story started around the campfires with, with primitive human beings, and it's core in our everyday lives. So that we understand. But now let's take it one step further. Why are we so influenced by stories as human beings?
Well, stories are just by the nature. When it's a true story, when it's a real story,
Hmm.
they have stories have a component that make them. And you've felt this before, right? Where a story becomes kind of a part of you. There are emotions in a story. There are details that our brains love to pick up on and memorize even without us knowing it. We can see the characters in a story and home in on a particular moment, and all of that makes stories extremely sticky.
Hmm.
And that happens both as the stories that we tell outwardly, but then of course the stories that we tell ourselves. I bet if I were to ask you, do you remember a moment from your elementary school PE class? Now, Tim, I don't know, maybe you were really great at PE, but I bet you could go back to like a particular moment in that PE class, physical education, whatever you called it, and you
Right.
could remember, see it as clear as day. Am I wrong? Is that true?
Wait, now how did you know I had a terrifying story with the rope climb as a kid? I mean, I remember.
No.
Yes, 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 yes. Yeah, we had this
Rope climb.
thin little mat in the, because I'm dating myself. I go back a few years. The thin little mat, and you're up 30 feet, and God forbid you let go. And that was talk about a traumatic story that I recall.
Is the But how funny is it that
Yeah.
I knew? Because you know what, everybody has, whether it's, I just heard a woman the other day talk about her rope climb. For me it was a pull up, for somebody else it was running the shuttle run. and
Hmm.
and this isn't a story that you necessarily remember that you remember, but all it takes is for me to ask the right question and it's right there. Now, what this can end up doing in our lives, there
Right.
was a woman who shared with me after reading the book that she realized one of the stories she told herself was about running. When she was in sixth grade, she was on the track team and she was one of the youngest ones. She was one of the tallest ones. And though she wasn't particularly fast, she had incredible endurance. And
Hmm.
so she could run really far distances. But about that time, there were some eighth graders, two eighth grade girls, as a matter of fact, who came up to her and said, "For as long as your legs are, you sure are slow." And ever since that time,
Oh,
that was 25, 30 years ago. And she
really?
realized that she stopped running altogether because even
Right.
though she was good at running, even though she had endurance to run, somebody once told her, and so she's held on to this story, that she wasn't quite good enough as a runner. And once she uncovered that story has been influencing her behavior for the past 3 decades, she decided to start running again.
So
Crazy.
this is the part that makes this whole topic of our own story so fascinating to me. So we all have them, and they're in various different aspects of our lives, personal, professional relationships, and we hold on to them. So I guess let me get into the fact of why is it so important to identify the story. I know you talk about it in the
Hmm.
book. Again, the book is
Yep.
Choose Your Story, Change Your Life, which again is a perfect title. Letting people know we have influence over this great tool. So,
Yep.
how important, Kindra, is it to analyze the story and its effects on you?
I think you said it there. This is one of the notes that I took down, was you said the phrase shining a light.
Hmm.
And that is absolutely the first step because this is something that we do automatically. We don't walk around consciously knowing that we can remember the very details of the rope climb in elementary school. As a result, these stories are allowed to run rampant in our
Right.
memories and influence our behaviors. So, catching yourself in one of these stories is the first step
Hmm.
in choosing a better one. So this very thing happened to me today. We've talked about you've mentioned a couple of times that these stories show up in various areas of our life. Maybe it's our business and career, maybe it's our family, health and well-being. For me, a money story came up. We're making some at a big financial crossroads in our family. I would say we're looking to uh, perhaps buy a condo or an apartment in New York City. No small feat. We've
Right.
purchased properties before. We know what this is about, but it's a big deal. And I've made some incredible financial decisions before in my life,
Sure.
things that have set myself and my family up for great success. However, I have also made some stupid financial decisions, like taking out student loans when I didn't need them and just spending all the money on clothes and plane tickets to go see a boyfriend who I broke up with. I mean, like
Oh,
this is right. And so we're at this financial crossroads and all of a sudden even just this morning um I heard some of my old stories creep in. Like, remember that time that you could only make minimum payments on your credit card? Or remember that time you spent so many hours on the phone with Wells Fargo, having them um, cut your overdraft fees in half,
right, right,
right? And so
right.
it's all these old stories that I can remember exactly where I was sitting when I made these bad financial decisions. And my brain is amplifying those because my brain wants to keep me safe. However, I also know that I have grown. I am in a different financial position. I've learned various lessons. I have
Sure.
a
Right.
partner who is,
Yeah.
it requires recognizing. I was standing in the bathroom putting on mascara and thought to myself, "Hold on, Kindra. You got some old stories playing right now." Um and it's only because this is what I do that I knew that that's what was happening. And
Right.
so identifying them, catching them in the act is the first step in being able to say, okay, I see you. And I need to take a look at this a little bit more closely and perhaps choose a better story.
So here you are, and I think a lot of us have stories about money. Almost everybody probably has stories of money, and you're about to
Yep.
make a big financial decision, and so your story gets a rewind from the past about when you were younger and didn't have as much good decision making around money, which we've all been there. So now
Right.
this is funny. So Kendra, you're the author on the subject. You're the expert on the subject.
I
The
know.
subject, the story pops in, right? But you identify it, so then you're able to kind of counteract it. So
Mm-hmm.
now what happens then? So somebody who's listening, somebody maybe who hasn't read your book yet, okay? And after the show, of course,
Yeah.
they're going to go out and get your book. But if they haven't read your book yet and they just realize that they have this mind trash going on, um, what is one of the most important things you need to tell the listener right now as to just how negative it can be if those negative stories go unchecked?
Right. Because that's the ultimate problem is if I only listen to those negative stories and they're
Right.
there. And that's also the thing that I need to make clear. There's a reason that the book isn't called Change Your Story because that happened. I was on the phone with Wells Fargo trying to cut my overdraft fee in half. Like I
Right.
made terrible financial decisions. I can't change that.
Right.
Um so the key here is then to see those because if I don't keep those negative stories in check, they will influence my decisions. And what
Right.
that
Right.
influence might mean is, oh gosh, well we can't buy something. We need to just keep renting and oh our rent's going up so we need to downsize. Oh that
Right.
I need to what it might make me think is I need to work harder. It could make me really frantic about how much money I'm bringing in, and like it can.
Yep.
That's when we start to, because it's these stories are making us. They're negative in nature. They're not wrong, but they're negative. They're
Mm-hmm.
going to encourage us to think things that are based in, or act based in fear, I
Right.
suppose.
Right.
Now, caution is not a bad thing. Like, I don't want to go back to being on the phone with Wells Fargo for hours at a time trying to cut my over. Like, I don't want to go there. And so
Right.
I've learned those lessons. Uh, but if we only listen to, and there are so many people who do that, and they don't, and even if they have had, whether it's health and well-being, you've made progress. Anyone who has made a ton of progress, lost sustained weight, or developed a significant amount of muscle and fallen off the wagon for a weekend,
Right.
that is the turning point right there. What are the negative? Oh, you always fall off the wagon. And so that's the beginning of gaining it all back again, or losing all the muscle tone. Whereas at that crossroads over the weekend, to say, you fell off the wagon this weekend, but you've fallen off before and you've gotten back on. Let's keep moving
Right.
forward. Right. So the true danger is these negative stories will influence your behavior. And depending on where you want to go in your life,
Right.
the influence those negative stories have may serve you or they may not.
Well, that was a great way of describing it, because as you're telling the story, Kendra, it's like if you don't check the negative story, it's, and it starts to get a grip on your behavior, then you might not be that far from starting to spiral out of control. Um,
Mhm,
I mean, that's how I'm kind of internalizing it.
mhm.
Now, it was interesting. In the book, you had referenced, I think it was one of your previous books, Stories That Stick, right?
Yep,
And
yep.
you talked about business gaps. And then, of course, in this book, you focused on, calling it, life gaps, if you will. So what is a life gap? And then how can, the person listening,
Yeah.
jump that gap?
Yep. I love this. You are this is, thank you for asking this question. So when you use story, you are the first person to do it. And this is it right here. This is where it makes all the difference. So in business,
Mm-hmm.
and in my first book, Stories That Stick, if you're struggling to make a sale, or if your marketing material isn't quite hitting, or if you can't quite seem to get your team on board with everything that's going to happen, what
Mm-hmm.
we often do is resort back to more information, when really what is more likely needed in these moments are compelling stories. The same is true in our lives. It's the gap in our life is where we are, and the distance between where we are and where we want to be. And what
Mm-hmm.
we don't realize is we go into our lives and we think that our lives are developed by, there's an event or a decision that needs to be made. We act, we take a certain action, or we behave a certain way that yields
Right.
to a certain result, and that result compounds over time. But the reality is, the true gap is between the event or the decision that needs to be made and that action point. There's a gap right there. And
Right.
that gap is where the stories come in. And if they're negative stories, it's going to influence the behavior that keeps you where you are. And if they're positive stories, it can influence the behavior to get you where you want to go. So, for example, back in December 2020, I had fallen off the exercise wagon. I know 2020 is like a four-letter word. I'm a big spin. I love going to Soul Cycle. I love group
Right.
fitness, and it just wasn't a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it was what it was, but it was one Sunday morning. I'm like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go exercise. I actually had a spin bike at my house. Like, why can't I just go ride the spin bike?
Right.
So here I was. I want to go ride the spin bike. That the gap is between me actually doing it,
Right.
and I cleaned my bedroom. I read the paper. I did the dishes. Then my husband had the audacity to throw on his shoes and just go out for a run without, and that triggered a whole new set of stories. So he doesn't have to feed the kids, and he doesn't have to. And I
Right.
finally decided to use my stories. And so I found three stories. One was from a wedding that I went to several years ago where I
Right.
had been taking care of myself. I'd been eating well and I felt amazing. And I looked amazing. And another story from another time. And then there was this one story from graduate school where um, the lifeguard at the pool where I'd been swimming laps, I called him Pool Boy. He asked me out on a date, and I remember exactly what I was wearing when he picked me up. And I opened the door to my apartment. This is many years ago, and he just looked at me and said, "Wow." And I was in great shape. I felt I was keeping those health and fitness promises to myself.
Right.
I told myself those 3 stories, and let me tell you what. I was ready to go hop on that spin bike. I told my kids, I'm like, unless someone is choking or bleeding,
Right.
don't bother me. And then I said,
Right.
don't eat anything. So
Right.
unless somebody is bleeding, like just let me go work out. And it was telling myself those 3 stories in vivid detail. Like I remembered the emotion. I remember how I felt. I remembered the dance floor at the wedding we were at, the
Right.
dress I was wearing, the shoes on my feet. And it was those stories that I put in that gap between me sitting in my bedroom or in my house and getting out and getting on an exercise bike. It was those stories in that gap that got me to take the action that actually moved me towards my goals.
So this is no, you know what it is? Because I love the topic, I was gravitated towards the book, listen, you're preaching to the choir on this. I
I know,
understand the
I know.
importance of what you're saying and, how you describe it and the techniques are so critical. I guess it's just, to me, what's a shame, but then what's also great news for you is how so many people don't have these tools yet. And in one sense, it's sad. In one sense, it's tragic. But it's really, and I'm not minimizing what you do, but to change it and to reverse it is not that difficult, right?
I know. I had to do a lot of self storytelling around how simple self storytelling is, honestly.
Yeah.
Like to say, because any of my inner critic would be saying, this is so simple. It just, why tell yourself stories about how you're a bad parent when there are so many stories you could tell yourself about how you're a great parent?
Right.
Why tell yourself all these stories about why you don't deserve the promotion that you got instead of telling yourself all the stories of the decades of work that you've put in to get to where you are? And
Right.
again, it is so simple, but sometimes the simplest things are the ones that we overlook.
All right. So how do you react to the comment when, because listen, I'm, Healy Success Solution sales performance coach. I'm dealing with sales professionals, small business owners every day. And, salespeople can be a negative bunch because they either win or lose every day. And they say, oh, I'm not negative. It's just reality. How do you react to it when people say
I
it's not negative, it's just reality?
You know what? Here's the thing. It comes all the way back to choice.
Mm-hmm.
You get to choose the stories you tell yourself and that are serving you. Now, I will say that there have been times in my life where quote unquote negative stories, like the stories of when I lost out on a particular gig or a time
Sure.
where I was overlooked, where it became like those stories encouraged the action that would lead me closer to my goal. So
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
it really is all about, like, if you find your so I there was a gentleman who had this belief that the world was out to get him, and he'd had it for a very long time. And so, like, business partners, he was always a little suspicious, and somebody who told him, regulators, he was like, oh, they're out to get me. And it was this very, now it made him more tedious in evaluating people. It made him, it gave him a little
Mm-hmm.
bit of an edge. That story, which
Sure.
on the surface level would appear to be negative, but it really served him until it didn't. Until he wouldn't trust anybody, until people didn't want to have relationships with him
Right.
because they always felt like he was, until it didn't. Now, it could it could be that there is again, this is why it's a little bit difficult. The only time a story is negative is if it isn't serving you.
Right.
So a story that could appear to be negative, but it is moving you forward, that's a story that's serving you. You can choose that story all day long until
But that's a
it's a
great
story that
distinction.
starts holding you back. Mhm.
Right, but that's a very important distinction. If it's a story that serves you, then it's not necessarily negative then.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
right. Now here's
You get
something
to choose.
yeah, right. Well, yeah, we do, right. And that's why this tool of stories is at everybody's disposal. There's no excuses for not using it. Now,
Exactly.
there's something in the book that I definitely want to discuss. You talk about, and I just love how you phrase it, verbal iceberg moments. What the heck are they?
Mm. That's when you actually like say something out loud or out loud in your own head. It's kind of
Mm-hmm.
like a defining statement. And these iceberg moments, the reason I describe it as an iceberg moment is sometimes we have these iceberg they're like the tips of the iceberg. One
Mm-hmm.
that I always struggled with was I don't have enough time. Oh, I don't have enough time. I've
Mm-hmm.
bitten off more than I can chew. I can never get through everything that I need to get done today. I don't have enough time. And that was kind of what was above the surface level of my consciousness. It was like this tip of the iceberg. Well, the mass of an iceberg, the part that's going to take you down, 90% of it is under the surface of the water. Like you don't
Right.
see it. And
Right.
Freud actually says 90% of our thoughts are unconscious. We don't see them. So the two
Right.
things are very much aligned.
Mm-hmm.
And so, really, a verbal iceberg moment is any of those big or small. One of them was, I said to my husband, this is years ago, he was like, "Oh, we're going to go on a ski trip." And I was like, "No, I don't like to ski." And he said, we were just dating at the time. And he said, "Wait, you ski?" And I was like, "No, I don't like to ski." He was said, "Well, when was the last time you skied?" And I said, on a field trip in fourth grade. And he was like, well, right, but even that, so it's not like a life-changing statement, but I don't like to ski was on top of this iceberg of me having this really miserable
Right.
ski experience with my dad, and it was but there were plenty of other points in my life where I could have evaluated whether
Yep.
or not I like to ski, tried other stories, right? So or it could be something as simple as, well, I'm not experienced enough, or I came from a bad neighborhood, or I don't have what it takes. I had an interesting conversation with Ryan Serhant, who's a top real estate broker in New York City. And he said, as we were talking about self stories, he was like, growing up, I was, this big, tall guy. Everyone thought I should be good at sports, and I was terrible. I was only good at theater. And so it kind of served me then when I came into real estate and I wasn't good at it to be like, well, I've never been good at the things I'm supposed to be good at, and look at where it got me, right?
Right. Right.
So I'm looking for some of those verbal, whether it's out loud that you say them or even in your own head. It's a good place to start to say, wait, there might be some stories there.
Wow. Now, I believe it was chapter 10. The great title is Stories Don't Grow on Trees. And you said it was very, very interesting. Money stories. Again, we've already spoken about money stories. You shared one of your own money stories. But I did want to make this distinction for the listeners. Money stories are generational. I thought that
Yeah.
was very interesting. I think a lot of people should hear. What do you mean by that?
There are, and I can't even begin to go into the depth and breadth of this. And I don't even in that chapter, right? It is just skimming the surface. A
Right.
whole series of books could be written on that. But um, I think that when you take a look at your money stories, and again, the research shows this
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
that these are like many stories, but these are stories that are handed down.
Right.
And your perception on where money comes from and how money is made and what role money has in our life and who gets to make money and who doesn't.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
um and that is just knowing that fact uh is really important, and to pause and say, okay, I believe this about money. These are my stories about money. But which of these stories have I just absorbed with without evaluation for
Right,
what
right.
I really think of it.
Hmm.
And again, that's where the agency comes in, the agency of wait, I get to choose what stories I believe. I don't necessarily have to accept every story that's been handed down to me.
So, I mean, there's so many more questions I could ask. So somebody's listening, they're relating to it, they're feeling the power of stories in their own lives as you're sharing today. Um, how does somebody, if somebody's identified a story that's holding them back, okay,
Mhm.
personally, physical fitness, whatever it is, once they've identified it, they've heard our interview and then they haven't read your book yet. So my question to you is this: This is what I want to leave the listener with. I've identified a story. I know it's limiting. How do I change it?
Yep. And that was I can give you the quick 2, 3, 4. So you
Mm-hmm.
can listen to this and take it and do something with it, knowing that in the book that it's much deeper on each of the
Mm-hmm.
2, 3, 4. But if
Sure.
you catch one of these stories in the act, the next step then is to ask yourself some pretty specific questions.
Mm-hmm.
Where does this story come from? Like, is this story even true? Was it true at some point, but it's true no longer? And you've heard me say it several times, but I'll say it again. Does this story serve me? And depending
Right.
on the answers that you get there, it'll be really helpful for you to then, I find in that analyze step, there's a lot of self forgiveness of, oh, no wonder I acted this way. It's because of this story, and this story. Like, oh, okay. I can
Right.
move forward from here. From there, it really is time to choose better stories, and for every story that isn't serving you, there is a story that can. And whether it's a story that has personally happened to you, which
Mm-hmm.
again, there's so much material there, but we don't
Right.
focus on that. Our biology has us focusing on the negative. To look for the stories that encourage the action that you then want to take. And then the final step really is what I'm asking you to do here. And so then, even this is why, even though it sounds very simple, so few people are able to do it. And if you've ever wondered, if you've looked at someone and wondered the mystery of how they got to where they are, when you know they maybe had a more challenging background and you know they only have the same hours in the day,
Right. Right.
it's because they've been more intentional about the stories they choose to tell themselves. And so the final step then is to actively work to reprogram your brain by installing these chosen stories. So if before you go into a sales pitch, you get these thoughts in your head of like, oh, you always stumble on your words, and you talk too much, and you've realized that these are stories that your big brother told you 20 years ago. Like, nobody wants to hear what you have to say. I mean,
Right.
we hold these stories that
Yes.
you can then tell yourself the story that you've chosen of, no, the last time I was in a sales meeting, they hung on every word and I closed the deal. It's weird that the story from 20 years earlier will hold more merit than the one that happened 2 weeks ago, but such is the way our stories work. So to intentionally choose and then install these stories, retell them to yourself in those moments when you really need them, that's when you start to see sustained transformation happen.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Now I'm out of breath. I like need a nap.
Well, listen, it's you've
I know.
you have an important story to share. No pun intended. With again the book "Choose Your Story, Change Your Life," Kindra Hall. I love the topic, as I think you can tell. I think you ended the show perfectly. How can people learn more about you? Follow you on social? What's the handle?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Instagram, it's at Kindra Hall. You can find me
Right.
the rest of the places from there. And then
Sure.
my
Sure.
website is kindrahall.com. I do have a space on there where you can sign up for my weekly, I don't want to call them newsletters because I'm usually sending video, but that's where I send
Okay.
out weekly storytelling videos to keep your skills sharp.
Awesome. That's a great resource. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, of
Appreciate it.
course.
Thanks, Kindra.
Oh, thank you so much. This was an absolute pleasure.
You got it. And this is the Profit Express. And remember to keep an eye out for each and every new show coming out on Wednesdays, shows like I just had with Kindra Hall. You can follow me in the show on Instagram at The Profit Express, on Twitter at Profit_Express, and on Facebook at The Profit Express. And until next week, remember to go out each and every day and continue to win the battle for business.